So let's make sure we also validate those user inputs when submitting them. And for that, to achieve this, I'll first of all add a new method here to new expense state. And this could be named submit form or submit expense data, something like this. And it should be triggered whenever this button at the bottom here is pressed, this one here. Here, instead of printing some dummy values, I want to trigger submit expense data by pointing at it. And inside of submit expense data, we now have to validate the data selected by the user. For that, we can use an if statement, about which we learned before in the course already, and check if title controller text after trimming it, which is a built-in method that simply removes excess white space at the beginning or end, if this is then empty. And isEmpty is a built-in property, just as trim is a built-in method. Trim can be called on strings, and text is a string, and isEmpty can be called on lists and strings, and the result of calling trim is a string, which is why we can use isEmpty here. So this overall will be true if we have an empty title or just a bunch of blanks. And if that's the case, then we want to show an error message, which we'll do soon. But of course, that's not the only case when we want to show an error message. Instead, we also want to show an error message if we have an invalid amount. Now, the amount is not just invalid if it's empty, but also if it, for example, is a text that doesn't qualify as a number, or if it's a number smaller than 0, because our amounts for the expenses here must be greater than 0. Therefore, as a first step, we have to transform the amount controller text, which we get, which is always a string, to a number. So our entered amount, as we could call it, has to be a number, not a string. And this transformation can be achieved by using double.tryParse, a method built into Dart. TryParse takes a string as an input and then returns a double if it is able to convert that string to a number, to a double, or it returns null if it's not able to convert it. So using TryParse on a text like hello would yield null, for example. TryParse on something like 1.12 as a string would yield 1.12 as a double, as a number. So that's something we have to do here. And with that done, we can add another variable, which could be called amount is invalid, which we want to set equal to true or false, so to a Boolean. But of course, we don't want to hard code true or false here. Instead, that should be derived dynamically by taking a look at entered amount, just as we're taking a look at the title text here. So what we want to check here is whether entered amount is maybe equal to null. Because I just mentioned, TryParse will yield null if an invalid number was entered, so some text that can't be converted to a number. So now amount is invalid will be true if entered amount is null, because indeed then the amount is invalid. But that's not the only case in which we would consider it invalid in this app here. Instead, the amount will also be invalid if it's smaller than 0, as mentioned. So here we actually want to derive true or false based on a combination of conditions. And in Dart, you can do this with two very important operators. The logical AND operator, which is written like this with two ampersand symbols, or the logical OR operator, which is written like this with two pipe symbols. And you will see this in many other programming languages as well. Of course, thus far you already saw some operators like plus or minus, which are used in mathematical operations. There also would be the asterisk operator for multiplication or the / operator for division. But where plus and minus and so on are used to derive numbers, and OR are used to derive booleans. and they help us derive booleans by combining multiple conditions. Here, the first condition is that entered amount is equal to null. In that case, amount is invalid will be true. Or it should also be true if entered amount is smaller or equal than 0. So if one of these two conditions is met, amount is invalid will be true. If both conditions are false, amount is invalid is false, but it is enough that one of them is met to set amount is invalid to true because of this logical OR operator. Well, and with that we now know when amount is invalid will be true. We can now add this here to our if condition, where we're checking whether the title is invalid with this code. Now we want to combine this condition with amount is invalid by again using the OR operator. The OR operator instead of the AND operator, because we want to make it into this if block where we want to show an error message in the future if at least one of our checks yields true. Because even if all the input values are valid, it's enough for one input value to be invalid to show an error message, because we need all input values to be valid, not most of them. So therefore here we want to now add amount is invalid. And this is now, of course, not a condition, but it is a value that contains true or false. And that's all the if statement wants. It wants a bunch of true or false values or expressions that yield true or false to know whether the code inside of the if statement should be executed or not. So we spent quite some time on this if statement already, but it is important to understand how if statements work and how these conditions work and how they can be combined. And we're of course also still not done, because the date could of course also be invalid. Therefore, we want to add another condition here, again with the OR operator for the reasons mentioned before. And here we want to check if selected date is equal to null. Because if that is null, which it can be if no date has been selected, then we also want to show an error message. We don't need to check the selected category because here we have a default category, so here it should not be possible to set this to no value. But for the other values it would be possible, and that's why we're checking them here. Well, and now we can make sure that we show an error message in this if statement.